Hello, friends, and all those who are watching us for our panel discussion. My name is Scott Spencer. I'm the pastor of Mosaic here in Oklahoma City. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And this panel discussion is meant to just inform you of what we think is going on currently in the United Methodist Church, what's some of the latest news, and what is some of our perspective. And I'm going to put on the screen real quick an email and a phone number that you can email any questions or text your questions either way, and I will try to monitor that as closely as I can. And while that's on the screen, let me just say that I'm fully aware that the panelists today are all pastors in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. So that leaves out a whole lot of pastors who live in much smaller towns here across our great state. And the reason for that is because all of us are either pastors of reconciling United Methodist congregations, or we are part of the reconciling movement. And we have already been speaking out on this issue. Our churches expect us to speak out. And we just wanted to have a free conversation where we didn't have to worry about what our local churches might be thinking about what we have to say. So that's part of the reason why our panel discussion today is made up of pastors from the city in Tulsa. Now, we have lots of other reconciling pastors across our state, but this is just the way this panel happened to work out. And maybe we'll have some future panels also that have a variety of other kinds of pastors and even laity. We've got about an hour of a presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A. We will finish by 6 p.m. And I want to encourage you to text or email your questions. I think the chat is also open on YouTube. You can put a question there, and I'll try to monitor that as well. And each of our speakers, I'll just ask them as they begin their presentation to introduce themselves and tell us just very, very, very briefly like where they're serving. But to begin our conversation this morning or this afternoon, I will start with just, we're going to just talk a little bit about the history of the church, because some of our history is very important to what we're going through today. And so many of you may be aware that our denomination was founded in the mid-18th century by John and Charles Wesley, along with others. And the Methodist movement has done a lot of great stuff over the past 250 to 300 years. And nothing that I or anyone else says today is meant to diminish all the good that we have done as the people called Methodist. But we're going to just point out perhaps some of the uglier sides, perhaps, of our history, which we think then sort of help us understand where we are today. And the Methodist Church in the United States officially formed in 1784 due to the Revolutionary War. And there was the need for there to be a specific denomination here in the United States that was not tied to what was happening in England. And Black people were welcomed in those early days, but they were not always treated equally. And in fact, by in 1800, the John Street Methodist Church, one of our earliest churches in Manhattan, out of that church started the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And this happened due to racism. And in 1816, Richard Allen and others split off from the Methodist Church and started the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And one of the stories I remember from my history class in seminary, the white folks could sit down in the sanctuary, but Black folks had to sit in the balcony. So there was a segregation. And one of the stories is that a Black person came down to kneel at the altar, either for prayer. I think it was for prayer. It could have been for communion. Maybe it was a salvation, altar call. But one of the ushers came and took the gentleman by the elbow and said, you can't kneel here next to these other people. There was segregation early in those days. And in 1828, there were Methodists that were dissatisfied because back then the church was led by the clergy and led by the bishops. And when you had annual conference sessions, when you had general conference, it was all clergy. In those days, laity did not have a voice or vote. And a group of Methodists just didn't feel like that was right. There was a movement for laity to have equal voice, equal vote. And so they really sort of believed in more of a congregational governance as well. But they really stayed strong with their Wesleyan doctrines and worship practices. But by 1828, this group formed the Methodist Protestant Church. And one of the things they did away with, interestingly enough, was bishops. So until they merged, in about 1939, I believe, they did not have bishops. Laity were given much more power. In 1843, and if you remember, in our own country, we were dealing with the issue of slavery. The Civil War was going to soon be upon us. The Wesleyan Methodist Connection in New York organized. This was a group of Methodist ministers and Methodist lay people, and they objected to slavery. That was one of the primary reasons they formed. There were other issues as well, and there was polity issues, but one of the primary reasons they didn't agree with slavery, and they felt that the Methodist Church was wavering on this issue and not speaking out as strongly as perhaps they had in the early days, or certainly as Mr. Wesley had. By the 1860s, the Free Methodist Church, also in the North, I believe in New York, formed. Part of the reason they're called Free Methodist is because in those days, the Methodist Church would charge people rent to have a pew. That was their pew to sit in, and the money would go to pay for things like organs or stained glass windows. These were things that the early Methodists really weren't into. These were sort of seen as extravagant and frivolous, and you're not really able to help the poor, if you're buying a big, fancy, expensive organ or putting in stained glass windows. But part of that word free also has to do with they did not believe in slavery. They objected to slavery. People should be free. And so that was one of the reasons why that the Free Methodist Church formed. In fact, slave owners were removed from the membership rolls. And they really stressed also the idea of multi-ethnic groups getting together to worship. Now, again, I lift up these church splits not to disparage the Methodist movement. Methodists were always doing good things all along. But church splits have been a part of our life together almost from the very beginning. And with that, I will turn it over to Valerie.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to share my screen just on a few little clips, just because I like for you to have things to look at so you're not looking at me, I guess. Let's see. So can everybody see that? At least the panelists, can you see it? Okay, yes. Good.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I say here we go again because, well, I love music and it speaks to me in all kinds of genres. So I'm always taking a couple of phrases from either R&B or country or just wherever I can find it. If it's a Broadway, I'll do that too. So this happens to be R&B this time, and it's from a group that has been around since the late 50s. And they have held on strong, even through death. They've held on strong, oddly enough, because they change and they move with the times. And they continue to be just as relevant today. And their music has even been sampled, oftentimes by hip hop artists and what have you throughout the decades. So this group is by the name of the Isley Brothers. And so, like I said, they've been around for a very long time, but they are classic R&B soul, let me tell you. And they have a song that they wrote back in they sung back in the 80s, or really, I think it came out in 1980. It's called Here We Go Again. And so that's where I am on this when it comes to talking about our swing around. Here we go again as far as splitting. Here we go again as far as having issues. Here we go again. It just seems like that's what it is. And so this, of course, is a love song about two lovers that for some reason they can't get along, but yet they can't leave each other alone. And so here's just a few of some of the lyrics. What do you do when you love somebody and everything is going wrong? Oh no, nobody knows the way you feel about it because only you know you can't leave it alone. Oh, here we go again. Oh, here we go again. I thought what we had was over. Here we go again. Oh, here we go again. What do you do when you love somebody and you decide to go it alone? Oh no, it never pays to give up on someone when on the inside the feeling is so strong. Oh, here we go again. Oh, here we go again. I thought what we had was over, but here we go again. Here we go again, indeed. Splitting or splintering, actually, as a denomination. It seems that the more notable schisms in the history of Methodism in the United States have been about inclusion versus exclusion. No more than 60 years after its official recognition as the Methodist Episcopal Church, the argument over whether bishops should own and enslave other human beings had finally come to a head. But before the major split took place in 1844 to form the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, there was plenty of harm done to African Americans who had worshiped in Methodist Episcopal Church congregations, segregated, of course, all in the name of God. The message of a God who had so ordained browner complexioned persons to be subservient, coupled with the unjust laws of the land and the prevailing dominant culture's bigoted belief system firmly in place, was always lauded over Black bodies and their existence, even in a place where it was preached that whom the Son had set free is free indeed, and there is no partiality with God. A lot of cognitive dissonance there. But clearly, as the early church did in Acts, worshiping with diverse people whom God created also would not be something the late 18th century to the mid 19th century Methodist Episcopal Church would even try to do. With the decision to separate in 1844 and following the Civil War, almost 20 years later, the African American Methodists who had not already transferred from the Methodist Episcopal Church South to the African Methodist Episcopal Church or African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion, left to form the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, now known as Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. It's a lot of that. I'd like to use acronyms, but I'm not, just because we do that all the time in Methodism. So this happened in 1870. However, there were still predominantly African-American Methodist churches across the US who were part of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Almost 100 years would pass before a merger occurred to form the Methodist Episcopal Church with the Methodist Episcopal Church North and South, the Methodist Episcopal Church itself, and Methodist Protestant Church. However, the Methodist Episcopal Church South would only enter the merger if something was done about the Black churches, which remained part of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Therefore, in 1939, the central jurisdiction was formed strictly for those churches so that Black bishops and clergy would not preside over annual conferences or be in the pulpits of predominantly white congregations. There would be attempts to abolish the central jurisdiction over the next 28 years, until finally in 1968 at the Uniting Conference in Dallas, Texas, the United Methodist Church was born with the aim to be a more inclusive church for at least persons of color and gender. Inclusivity for our LGBTQ siblings remains an ongoing struggle. And even in the United Methodist Church today, persons of color and women, which I seem to encompass both, still find they are not seen. The late Reverend Gilbert H. Caldwell, a civil rights pioneer in the Methodist Church, said it best in a 2018 interview. He said the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that separate but equal is invalid. But our central jurisdiction was not officially dissolved until 1968. It took 14 years for the Methodist Church to begin to swing towards that arc that tends to lean towards justice. And then he said, Martin Luther King Jr. raised this question: why is the church always the tail light rather than the headlight? Now, during the civil rights era, there were Methodists who participated in the struggle for equal rights for all, but there were also Methodists who did not agree with the civil rights agenda, as they would put it. And so we continue to have infighting even with that, but in a lot of places still, not only do we struggle with the inclusivity of our Black brothers and sisters and siblings, our persons of color, siblings, women being in leadership, but we also are now struggling with fighting for the justice and the rights for inclusivity for our LGBTQ community. And just like the question was overwhelmingly presented from the very beginning of Methodism in the United States and seems to still be, what should we do with the Blacks? Finally, the question has come up that we continue to struggle and ask this question, which is insane. What are we going to do with the LGBTQ? Here we go again. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm going to put up on the screen as soon as Valerie quits sharing her screen. There we go. Just an email and a phone number you can send questions to. Some of you have already sent some questions, and you've already sent some questions on YouTube. We are monitoring that, and we'll get to those in the second hour. Just to sort of pick up where Valerie left off, very briefly, let me say that there was another stream of Methodist growing right alongside the Methodist Church. This was the Evangelical Church and the United Brethren Church. Their leaders were heavily influenced by John Wesley and Wesley's theology and the early Methodist leaders. And in 1946, these two denominations, who in essence really held the same theology and even the same polity, the difference between them and the Methodist Church were English speaking. The Evangelical United Brethren churches were primarily German speaking. But in 1946, these two denominations joined together to form the Evangelical United Brethren Church. Many churches across our state are former EUB churches. One of the things that happened is that in 1968, this denomination, the EUB, and the Methodist Church merged, and that's how we became the United Methodist Church. The Methodists had the Articles of Religion that Wesley had given them from the Anglican tradition. The EUB Church had the Confession of Faith. In 1968, we said these two statements of faith, these two statements of doctrine and theology, we're going to say that they're equal, side by side. But also in 1972, our General Conference officially adopted a theological statement that really endorsed pluralism. Pluralism being the idea that we didn't have just one strict way of believing or one set of beliefs that you had to assent to, but that we had a variety of beliefs that we believed were possible under the same roof or the same tent. Part of what happened in 1972 was this introduction of what we call the quadrilateral, where we talk about not only scripture informing our beliefs, but also tradition and experience and reason. The New York Times reported in 1972, the guidelines which endorse theological pluralism do not replace any doctrines or offer a new creed that would be binding on the 10.5 million members of the denomination. But they put the present doctrines in historical perspective, and they suggest that Methodists measure their beliefs against 4 criteria: scripture, tradition, personal experience, and reason. Scriptural texts are to be interpreted in the light of their place in the Bible as a whole, as this is illumined by scholarly inquiry and personal insight. Approved overwhelmingly on the 6th day of the conference, this statement encourages varying theological positions within the framework of basic Christian doctrine, a principle referred to as theological pluralism. That was the New York Times in 1972. Fast forward to 1988. Many Methodists had become dissatisfied and disillusioned and simply didn't agree with the idea of pluralism per se. So we took that idea out of the Book of Discipline at a vote at the General Conference in 88. And we then said that scripture is primary, that we still use tradition, reason, and experience in helping form our beliefs, but that scripture would always be primary. Pluralism was in 72, but out in 88. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
So it is consistent with Wesleyan theology and Methodism from the beginning to have a big tent kind of theological understanding. So the unity of the church in 1968 was not without precedent. We have in the Catholic Spirit sermon from John Wesley, he says, surely if, hold on, let me find it. Though we may not think alike, may we not love alike. Although there is a difference in opinion or modes of worship, may it not need it prevent our union or our affection. Though we may not think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion. Without all doubt, we may. And this was a philosophy that Wesley held to. He was more interested in orthopraxy than in orthodoxy. And so one of the phrases that has been brought up in the recent discussion over this potential split in the United Methodist Church is that commitment to orthodox belief. Orthodoxy is right belief, or the belief that is held by most to be true or right. And it is implied then that there is only one right way to interpret the scriptures as they apply to LGBTQ people, specifically to marriage and to ordination. But that disregards this history that we have of using reason, experience, and to interpret scripture. And so we have some differences of opinion about how to interpret scripture, but the thing is that progressive Methodists do not disregard scripture. So the idea that progressive Methodists are completely just disregarding scripture and throwing out scripture is wrong. And I have really kind of put my heart into looking deeply at the scriptures as they apply to this question about whether LGBTQ people can marry and whether we can bless their marriages and that be consistent with an interpretation of scripture that takes into account what we now know about biology and about the way that human sexuality is determined, that it is not a choice, that it is biologically based. And the evidence that we have using our personal experience of people who are LGBTQ, who are able to be called to ministry and be very effective and fruitful in ministry, that they show the gifts and graces for ordination, and that they show gifts and graces for fruitful marriages. This idea that Orthodox beliefs requires that we never change our interpretation of scripture, then gives us a whole problem of hermeneutics when we look at the way we have reinterpreted scripture when it comes to the full inclusion of women as clergy, when it comes to equality of men and women in marriage, when it comes to the full equality of people of all races and ethnicities and nations in our church. So I think that it is absolutely consistent with our Methodist heritage, our Wesleyan heritage, to take what we now know and to look at the scriptures and the interpretation of the scriptures through a lens that is a lens oriented around what would Jesus do? How would Jesus interpret these scriptures as they apply to the LGBTQ people in our pews and in our churches? There is real harm. So our three general rules, first is do no harm. There is real harm that is being done because of an interpretation of scripture that says that it is a sin to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. 40% of youth who are not affirmed, who are LGBTQ, attempt suicide or complete it. That is absolutely clear evidence of harm. And so it is, I think, orthodoxy to say the evidence shows that an interpretation of scripture that prevents LGBTQ people from fully living into the way that God has created them to be is not orthodox. That is not right belief because it causes harm.
Thank you, Jen. And Trina Bose North is now going to just briefly talk about the history of the LGBTQ movement for inclusion in the Methodist Church for, say, the past couple decades.
Hi, I'm Trina, and I am the pastor at Crown Heights United Methodist Church, which is a reconciling congregation, and we're about to have our second reconciling anniversary later this month. I would like to give just a little bit of background to where we are in the denomination as United Methodist Church on our policies on LGBTQ folk. I'm going to back us up. I'm going to start in 1996. So 1996, just so you all know, we have general conferences every 4 years, and it's the same 4 years as the presidential elections. So we're going to be talking about those years in particular. In 1996, we already had in our books the statement saying that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and that we were not ordaining gay people if they were self-avowed practicing homosexuals. And in 1996, though, we at the General Conference in Denver voted to kind of strengthen that language by prohibiting marriages in United Methodist churches by United Methodist clergy. And I think this was a really significant year because putting aside ordination, marriage is something that every single church deals with. And this rule not to have marriages really affects every single clergy on how they're able to pastor. And so starting in 1996, there was this just stronger line between inclusivity and exclusivity. And really both sides were starting to dig in and to kind of strengthen their sides. So we go through a few more general conferences with, I would just say, the tension getting stronger. By the time we make it to 2012, that was another really significant general conference. This general conference was down in Florida, and I think what makes it very interesting is two things. Number one, people who did the math for the United Methodist Church were realizing that the liberal side, the inclusivity side, the pro-LGBT side was not going to win at General Conference. We were getting further apart, further away from turning this vote than closer. And let me tell you why. Because back in the 1970s, the United Methodist Church was sending missionaries all over the world. And prior to this particular general conference, they would start churches, but spin them off and let them be autonomous, Methodist, whatever, but not United Methodist. But in the 1970s, we decided, let's all be together as United Methodists. And so we became a worldwide church. That really made an impact in 2012. 2012, about 1/3 of the delegates were from worldwide churches. And I want you to picture that when 33% are coming from a small group in Europe, a larger group from Philippines, and then the largest group from Africa, it was definitely impacting our votes. Where in the Philippines and in Africa, they vote on this issue as a cultural issue as they see it, and they're not voting pro-LGBTQ. Okay, so we're getting further apart. The numbers are shifting from the US to worldwide, and the people who are doing the math are like, General Conference is not our key. This is not working out. And so the liberals started to look around. And what was another thing that was happening in our country is that LGBTQ or the topic of homosexuality was being brought up in other denominations as well. So the Presbyterian Church, the Lutheran Church, the Episcopalians, they are all talking about LGBTQ. They are making headway. They are moving forward and finding ways for people, everybody, to be in ministry and to be married. UCC, thank you. But the United Methodist Church could not make that step because of our population. And so what happened in 2012 was that a large group of United Methodists started saying, we're done complying. And so what that looks like in our denomination is the Western jurisdiction stopped bringing up charges, stopped enforcing these rules against ordination and against marriages. And so like right now, the Western jurisdiction as a whole, there is no rule against, or I'm sorry, I guess there's technically a rule. There's no enforcement of this rule. You should also know that this is true in conferences on the East Coast as well, and in churches in the North Central jurisdiction. I'm leaving out the South. I'm sure you can imagine why. In the South, it's a little bit different. We are kind of the conservative bloc in the country. And so it's much harder here to have that kind of freedom without enforcement of the rules. Okay, so that was 2012. 2016, General Conference met in Portland. And this was a year where the bishops stopped the voting on this topic because it was turning contentious quickly. And what they did is they called a special general conference for 2019 to take on this topic. And I'll tell you that I think that the bishops truly hoped that this would be a time when the United Methodist Church would have room for everybody. Like, I think that the goal was, if 40% of the people would like to be inclusive, let them be inclusive, but still be under one name of United Methodist. But 2019 came, and we had a special general conference in St. Louis, and we did not come together. In fact, this bloc from the South and Africa and the Philippines, they voted together. They used their numbers to strengthen the rules and the penalties against clergy who marry gay people, against bishops who ordain gay folks. And so we really left that general conference further apart. And by the way, that's where we are right now. We're going to talk some more about General Conference and about what might be coming. So I'll turn it over to the next person.
Before we move on, let me just say thank you for all those who are watching. I'm going to put on the screen the email and the phone number you can send questions to. Some of you have put some questions on YouTube. We are keeping track of all those questions. And our intention, we've got about 30 more minutes of a presentation. Then we'll take up to an hour for a Q&A time. We have now basically concluded some of the history of our denomination. I just want to add one thing, though, that I'm not for sure Valerie mentioned. I'm sorry, Valerie. I didn't hear every single word you were saying. But even though there were splits happening in 1800 around race, and all this turmoil continued throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, the civil rights, as you've mentioned, it wasn't until about 20 years ago that the United Methodist Church sort of came together with the AME Church, the AME Zion, the CME, and a couple of other denominations that are Methodist, and to say, you know what, we're really in full communion. We all belong to the Wesley Council, the Worldwide Council, which now I can't think of the name of it, the World Methodist Council. But to say we're in full communion just makes that a stronger link. We're not merging our denominations, but we're really saying we're one and we're in full communion. But it took 200 years for that to happen. And in all honesty, maybe practically we've not done much with that on a local level. I want to give you just a brief outline of where we're headed. David is going to talk just briefly about how General Conference works. Jen is going to talk about the protocol as well as the Christmas covenant and some of the connectional table proposals. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the different caucuses and how they sort of fit into this. What are some ways that United Methodist and United Methodist churches could be working right now? And then we're going to talk about post-separation Methodist possibilities, and then we'll move into a Q&A time. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Scott. David Wiggs here. I'm pastor at Boston Avenue Church in Tulsa. Just a little background. If you don't know exactly how our structure works, we do have 3 branches. A lot about United Methodism. Looks a lot like the United States government. They were growing up at the same time. So in Methodism, we have a judicial, an executive, and a legislative branch, just like the national government does for the U.S. General Conference, as someone mentioned earlier, typically meets every 4 years, but as Trina mentioned, we have a special called General Conference in 2019. But again, like the United States, we're a representative body, so delegates get elected. So local churches elect delegates to match the number of clergy that are assigned there. So if you have one pastor, you have one lay delegate. If you have more than one pastor, depending on how many people are appointed, you have that many lay delegates that can be elected to represent you at an annual conference. Our annual conference happens to be the statewide boundaries of Oklahoma. That's not true in all areas. Texas has 5 different annual conferences, so it's not always state boundaries, but it is for us. Annual conference then is apportioned a number of people they can elect on the clergy side, matching that on the laity side. So the annual conference delegates elect delegates to the general conference as well as to the jurisdictional conference, but we won't get into jurisdictional conferences right now, except for say they're regional rather than an international gathering. So those delegates represent us at a general conference. They don't have any kind of, they're not bound to vote in any certain way based on anything the Oklahoma Annual Conference has said. They basically vote their conscience or their perspective. Often when elections are going on, at least on the clergy side, some on the laity side, people do kind of campaign and say, I'll be representing these kind of positions, or I'll be representing these kind of positions. So the annual conference elects delegates to represent all of us in Oklahoma to go to the general conference. The other question is, so what do they talk about? How do we know what the agenda is going to be? The Council of Bishops brings some of that, but anybody, any United Methodist person, any United Methodist organization, any United Methodist church can write a piece of legislation or send a petition to the general conference. There are rules about format and how early they have to be presented and that kind of thing. But all of those by the discipline have to be considered by a legislative committee. And if the legislative committee approves of them, then they go to the general session of the general conference where the whole body is to vote on those. The bishops have the power to some voice, no vote, but they are the ones who preside over these legislative sessions. And then the Judicial Council rules on whether or not things that were passed fit our Constitution or not. If they're requiring a constitutional amendment, then that legislation has a year to be sent back to every annual conference around the world. 2/3 of those have to vote in favor of that or to change the Constitution. Sometimes Judicial Council rules that what the General Conference delegates passed is not constitutional at all. So that happened back in 2012. There was a whole new plan for structure. People seem to be excited about it from many different perspectives. Judicial Council said parts of it are unconstitutional, which means the whole piece is null and void. So that's sort of those 3 bodies work in conjunction to try to move the church forward. I think it was a structure designed for a homogeneous group like people in the United States who all function within a democratic society and understood compromise and could meet for 10 days and make some decisions on behalf of the whole group. As Trina was telling us, that view of the church changed dramatically as we became a global church. And you can just see as you watch General Conference over the years, or at least I believe I can see, it's become more and more dysfunctional in terms of being able to make decisions on behalf of the whole body that the whole body will actually endorse and use to function to go forward. So most recently, because of COVID, postponed general conference, which was supposed to happen in 2020, rescheduled for a year later, also postponed because of COVID, rescheduled for 2022, end of August, beginning of September. There's speculation that that still will not happen because of the inability to get delegates from around the globe together in any kind of way that is fair in terms of representation of everybody. So there's war and civil war in some countries where delegates can't travel. There's obviously vaccination levels that are very different in different parts of the globe. There's even internet access problems. You know, it was looked at the possibility of having a digital experience. That did not happen. So COVID has just wreaked havoc with General Conference and the denomination, just like it's disrupted our own local churches. But because of all those postponements, there are all kinds of constitutional issues now where bishops' terms have expired, terms of the judges that are elected to judicial council have expired. There are some who say we don't even have a quorum for judicial councils. So any decisions being made right now are really not legal decisions at all. I don't know how that will be finally determined when they are the Supreme Court. So I don't know who you go to make a decision that they're out of order. But I think the other thing that's important to note in the environment that we live in, where we have a Wesleyan Covenant Association, which openly says they are the Orthodox, they are leaving, the rest of us, you know, don't qualify as Christian, and they have a new denomination of the Global Connection Church. When they meet, I believe they speak as if they're speaking for the whole church. The discipline is clear on this. Nobody speaks for the whole church except for the General Conference. No caucus, no advocacy group has any standing. They speak as if the protocol, if you know what that is, has already happened. That is not true. It has not been voted on. The likelihood of it passing, I would say, is nearly zero right now, even though it has some great parts to it about how we could separate in some semblance of order. It has timelines and dates in there. No way we will meet those with these postponements. The discipline says if it's presented as a piece of legislation, but parts of it don't work, then you throw out the whole. So I think there's no way the protocol passes, even though it has some pieces that would help us, I think. I'm not against it. It's just because of the postponements, there's so many constitutional issues with it. I don't think it will ever make it. Bishop Nunn, even though people have different opinions about his leadership, I will voice none except for to say he is my bishop. He has set up an office of transition, seeing the difficulties ahead, either with clergy wanting to leave the denomination or churches. And so beginning July 1, we'll have a new office in our Oklahoma conference structure that is designed specifically to deal with pastors and churches who think they want to disaffiliate with the denomination or go do something different. Again, some people speaking make it sound like, hey, we've decided and we're out of here. That is not how the United Methodist Church functions. The United Methodist Church is the only denomination these people are affiliated with. So there's a lot that will have to happen before a pastor or a congregation or a group of congregations can leave. The other thing, this will be my last comment, Scott, that was said at WCA/Global Methodist Connection Plan Church was that they were pretty sure our whole annual conference in Oklahoma was going to become a part of this new denomination. There is no provision in the discipline that allows for an annual conference to disaffiliate with the denomination. Our bishop has said that's unconstitutional. It can't even come up for a vote. In the protocol, there was this idea of if you had 57% of an annual conference, that takes the whole annual conference. That is not in the discipline. It's not part of our polity. Whether it ever will be is yet to be determined. So when people say things like, this is how it's going to happen, that is total conjecture and speculation. I would say just be very cautious about anything you hear or see where people say, I know this is going to happen in the future. This is not clear. I don't think anybody has a crystal ball and can predict what's going to happen. They also speak as if the United Methodist Church will seek to exist. I think that's totally inaccurate. I believe that's misinformation, may or may not be on purpose. It appears to me to be on purpose because it plays to their strategy of trying to destroy the denomination. But I believe there will continue to be a United Methodist Church. I believe it will be inclusive. I intend to be a part of it. So we'll see what happens, but just that general caution and warning that people speaking about the future usually sound way more sure than they have any grounds to be. I'll leave it there, Scott.
Thank you, David. And that does answer one of the questions that's come up. One of the questions was, the Oklahoma delegates, do we have a sense of what direction we'll take? And I assume that might be asking, are we going to go more to the conservative side or more to the progressive side? And I think we have heard a lot about that. Jen is going to mention the protocol in a moment and explain that to us. But for people who have sort of been hanging on to this, well, we're going to get to vote. It's kind of been shown that, as David has mentioned, that's probably unconstitutional. If the protocol were to pass, that would probably be challenged, and the Judicial Council would rule on that. And although we could sit here and guess how they would rule, we're Methodists, we don't bet, so we don't gamble, right? And so the reality is we don't know. But there are some very smart people saying that the protocol, as it's written, with the idea of 57% taking the conference a certain direction is unconstitutional. And I will just say that I think it's is it William Lawrence? Am I right? William Lawrence has written great articles about that. I'll look up that website and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that is one of the questions that has come up. And I would just say this also, David, that it seems like conservatives and liberals and progressives tend to think, well, we think we may have the votes. And like you said, the WCA said this out loud. We all watched it online. We think 57% of our conference would vote to become more traditional. But I've heard a lot of liberals say the same thing. And I always just say, until the votes are counted, we really don't necessarily know, although we can be educated about our conference. Yes, we're not, but let's just wait till the votes are counted. But it may be that we're not going to have that type of vote anyway. So to say all of that, if you don't know what the protocol is, here is Jen.
Okay, so there is, backing up to when we left 2019, there was a great hope that what would happen would be that the One Church plan, which was proposed by the Commission on the Way Forward, which was an official group that was asked to propose legislation. There was a great hope that that's what would pass and would allow individual churches and then individual conferences make decisions about how we are going to marry and ordain gay people. That did not happen. We ended up with a doubling down on the traditionalist plan, as Trina told us about. And when we left General Conference in February of 2019, that traditionalist plan went into effect January 1st, 2020. And we thought that we would be going to General Conference in May 2020. So we thought we had just a few months to live under the traditionalist plan. Because there had been this great hope and because the vote was so close, there was a group which included people who were on both sides. I hate to use the word sides, but that's where we are. That included people on both sides and was a globally convened group that came up with this protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. And this group was mediated by a non-United Methodist attorney, Kenneth Feynman, and was very carefully negotiated out and included all of these pieces. Now, it's really important to know that the protocol has not passed. It was not brought, we haven't had a General Conference, we haven't had a chance to vote on it yet. Not only that, there was an effort to take the protocol to Judicial Council before it was brought up for a vote at General Conference. Judicial Council said, no, we can't vote on proposed legislation since it hasn't been passed yet. We can't touch it, so it's going to have to go through General Conference first. Now that General Conference has been delayed, the protocol for separation has some provisions in it that would allow churches to go ahead and leave and form a new denomination. But something else that happened at the end of General Conference 2019 was this quote unquote gracious exit provision, which was passed, but then was challenged because of some voting irregularities. And it has just come back down recently from Judicial Council that did pass and does stand. So there is a way for churches who disagree with the current stance to go ahead and leave. The problem, or I guess what we're waiting for, is that the protocol includes a financial incentive for the churches that want to go ahead and leave and form their own denomination to wait and see through the passing of the protocol and then the ratification of the constitutional amendments that would be required in order for them to have $25 million to start their new denomination. The protocol also would provide $2 million for other denominations that wanted to separate, but the WCA, which is now the Global Methodist Church, already had enough of their infrastructure in place to basically negotiate that $25 million that they could take and use as seed money for starting their new denomination. Now, the protocol also includes that we would continue to hold some global ministries in common, that we would have our pension and health benefits would be held by Westpath and not be held by either denomination. There are a lot of details in that, that if you're interested, you can find the details online, or we can talk about it in the question and answer. The issues with the protocol are, first of all, getting it through General Conference, but also then it would require constitutional amendments that would then have to be ratified by 2/3 of the annual conferences. It also does not do anything, does not propose any legislation that then would correct or renegotiate what was settled in the traditional plan, where people who are LGBTQ would still be prohibited from being married and from being ordained in the church. So some questions still exist on what would happen in order for then legislation to be taken up to potentially change that. There's a question of order, but the connectional table had proposed already, even before 2019, that the United States become its own central conference. Now, this is loaded because of the old central jurisdiction, which was established to perpetuate racism. And instead of calling it the central conference, it was renegotiated that it would be called Regional Conference of the United States. And then a group that was organized by some churches that were outside of the United States came up with what is called the Christmas Covenant, that would basically expand that so that there are several different regions, and it would correct some of the colonialism that is a part of our basic structure, is the idea. So all of these three pieces of legislation, the Christmas Covenant, the connectional tables proposal for the United States becoming its own regional conference, and then the protocol of grace through reconciliation through separation, all three of those are three separate things that could pass and be compatible with one another. So they don't conflict. It's not like a choice between all three of those. It's that they could all pass, and they each contain different pieces of legislation. Anything I didn't cover? If you have questions about everything I just said and want more details, put that in the chat. We will address those questions. We can also get some resources out for those.
Yes, I keep track of your questions. Once again, I'm just going to put this up on the screen, and I'm going to let David just speak very briefly about some of the roles of caucuses and other groups in the church.
Thanks, Scott. I think it's very important that we, if you've never been to a general conference or haven't watched those and not been a delegate, which is most of us, it is important to know that almost no important legislation goes to general conference and is passed in the form in which it was submitted. There's so many voices and so many ideas that changes are almost always made. So again, people who believe that any single proposal is going to breeze through a meeting that has, I think it's going to be 866 delegates, I think doesn't realize how this general conference experience works. But there are caucuses, the Wesleyan Covenant Association is one, but they had forebears on the conservative side of the confessing movement, the good news movement, and others that you might be familiar with. Again, they speak as if they're already a denomination. I think it's important to realize there are no global Methodist churches or clergy. They're all right now United Methodist. So when they speak as if they're already a denomination, again, I think it's great speculation and wishful thinking. Not that it couldn't happen. There are a group of people that want to leave, but I think they presume way too much in their presentations currently. There's also, on the more liberal side, a Liberation Methodist connection or church that's organizing as a new branch of Methodism that we haven't even spoken of. So there will be others that will emerge, I would predict, particularly if the church is giving out sums of money in the millions of dollars. If you got a caucus group, you might want to become a denomination and get some funding that way. But there's also groups that are not looking to be a denomination, like the Reconciling Ministries Network, that has been a long time justice and advocacy group within Methodism, working for full inclusion. After the 2019 General Conference, where the One Church plan, as Trina was talking about, was an inclusive plan at some level that did not pass. There were a group of clergy and lay people across primarily the U.S., but not exclusively, that said reinforcing the traditional plan is going to create even more harm. And we are against that. We're against the traditional plan. We're against the exclusion. We're against the harm. So they have a website. You can find resistharm.com. Lots of resources, everything from marriage rights to prayers to worship resources, ideas for advocacy and direct action and all that kind of thing. They're not an organization. They're not funded by the United Methodist Church. They are United Methodist, working together across the country to provide solidarity in this meantime while we're waiting for a general conference to happen. So they're supporting candidates for ministry that are in the LGBTQ plus community, people who are already ordained, churches that are working to be inclusive, lay people who want to work in their church for greater inclusion, all of that kind of thing. So they're trying to provide that kind of visibility and solidarity and support, as well as helping clergy either that are candidates or already in the system that are being discriminated against. So that's primarily what that is. You can find their website. But there are all these caucus groups, kind of like in politics, that try to influence what's happening at the meetings where votes are being taken. And this has just been, I think, a part of the Methodist experience for a very long time. Back to you, Scott.
Thank you, David. Kathy is going to speak about, well, in the midst of all of this, what can we be doing today?
Hi, I'm Kathy Brown. I'm the pastor at St. Paul's in Tulsa. We are a reconciling church, so I will start off by saying I know that that gives us a different angle as we come into what can we be doing now. Scott has been sharing with us the questions that you all are asking. You've got some great questions. I'm going to leave my part short, but what I want to encourage you all is to start, if you are not already, start having conversations. As I've talked to clergy friends that are in churches that aren't reconciling, what they say to me is, Kathy, I am afraid of stirring up a hornet's nest. This is over a year away, almost 2 years away. I'm trying to get people back into our building after the pandemic. I'm not ready to talk about it. But at the same time, I have laity friends who are in other churches that are calling me and saying, we're not talking about it. Can you tell me what's going on? As you all are seeing, the WCA is finding ways to get themselves in the news. So the information that something is going on is out there. So what I would encourage you all to do, whether you're clergy or laity, is to have what I call non-threatening conversations at this point. When we got back from the general conference, I have to say I was one of those that went into the special general conference not believing the traditional plan would pass. I told our congregation, I don't think it's going to pass. It is mean-spirited. So when we came back, we had together and we had an all-church meeting and we broke up into small groups. And I asked these 4 questions about what do we do while we wait? Because at that time, as Jen said, we thought our waiting period was going to be short, but we keep kicking that can down the road. So we are still in that waiting period. So the questions that I asked was, what's important while we wait? And I had them talk about that. And then I asked them, what do you need from your pastor while you wait? What do you need from your leadership team while you wait? And what do you need from each other while you wait? Those were questions that just got us talking about how we can be supportive to one another. After the protocol came out and it looked like there was a possibility of a split, I didn't want to assume that I knew where St. Paul stood. I thought I had a good idea, but I wanted to talk with them. So I had a series of coffee chats where we met in small groups. And the first thing I asked them was, each person was, how long have you been a United Methodist? Because what I have found is how long we've been a United Methodist is tied to our heartstrings. It's a totally different story for someone who has just come in as a United Methodist because they like this particular church. And then I asked, what is it that you love about the United Methodist Church? And then what is it that you love about our church? What are the values that are the most important to you? Again, all these were just gaining information and not trying to cause division. We're in an old historic building. I asked, what is it that you love about our building? I needed to see how tied we were to that. And then the last question I asked was, as we move forward, what is most important to you? And without a doubt, what I heard from the people of St. Paul's is that we stay together as an inclusive, affirming church. Yes, we love being a United Methodist, but that's not the important thing. Yes, we love this old historic building, but that's not the most important thing. That's not going to be true for all congregations, but for us it was. And I feel like by us having those conversations, it has allowed us to hear what's going on in the news and knowing that communication is still open. So that's my encouragement for at this time, start having conversation. And if laity, have conversations with yourselves. If your pastors are saying, I'm not ready to talk, have conversations with yourself. So.
Kathy, you said, what do we need from your pastor? What was your question before that?
What's important while we wait? Just that general question. What's important while we wait?
And you said, what do we need from our pastor? And then what was the next question after you
what
said?
Do you need from your leadership team?
Okay.
And then what do you need from each other?
Anything else, Kathy?
Nope, that's it. I look forward to hearing a bit more, and then I'm ready to hear some answers to these questions. So
Well, next up is Jeannie, who has been waiting patiently. So Jeannie, we're going to turn it over to you, and then we'll be heading into the Q&A after your presentation.
Thank you. I'm Jeannie Himes from St. Stephen's United Methodist Church in Norman, Oklahoma. I want to begin by reading just a few words from Rainer Maria Rilke. All will come again into its strength, the fields undivided, the waters undammed, the trees towering and the walls built low, and in the valleys, people as strong and varied as the land, and no churches where God is imprisoned and lamented like a trapped and wounded animal, the houses welcoming all who knock, and a sense of boundless offering in all relations, in you and in me. I take heart in words like that, in thinking of a church in which God is not trapped into a structure that does not feed the people, because that is not the God that we serve. And so I want to say that I am optimistic and hopeful about what lies ahead. We talk about our time as after the separation as that we will be the post-separation United Methodist Church. And that's not to say that we're going to have this bulky, awkward name, but that we recognize that the church will look different after the separation, and that all forces are moving toward a separation. So we're preparing our hearts for that by saying that we will be different, and that the post-separation United Methodist Church will be together, but will be different than what we have been, and what we certainly have been for the past 30 some years. So in pointing that direction, I want to also bring up a website called stayumc.com. This is an excellently done website, and something really important is that it comes from Alabama, from an annual conference in the Deep South, where they have come together to really work on how to encourage, strengthen, and bring together centrists in the denomination, and to say that no, this is not your only choice to go with the far right just because they have developed a shiny new denomination that they're saying, you know, is very attractive. What we have, and what will be home for us still, will be the United Methodist Church, even if the name changes, and even though we will look different. So they make a number of points that are excellent. And so especially if you are part of a church that encompasses all positions, or you think is very centrist and is looking for good resources, I would point you toward that, because they make some excellent statements. One of those is that they point out that the new forming denomination, the Global Methodist Church, is heavily led by and influenced by large suburban congregations. And because of that, you can see within the structure that small churches, inner city churches, and rural churches are not going to fare well within that new denomination. And so just because some people are frightened by the change or wanting to be more conservative does not mean that that is going to be a viable option for them. They also point out that the vast majority of young people will not be wanting to go toward a denomination that is more restrictive and closes doors on people. The folks who are a part of this new group are overwhelmingly older, overwhelmingly white, and as I said, overwhelmingly suburban people. So a couple of those things, but Also, the point that none of the 13 United Methodist seminaries has any indication toward going in that direction, and none of the United Methodist colleges and universities has expressed that they are going to be going in that direction. So that's a lot of our education right there, and a lot of our history that is tied up in the educational institutions that Methodists have started and have historically supported. So the reasons for optimism that I have about the post-separation United Methodist Church. First of all, the United Methodist Church is being a large denomination across the United States, has always followed kind of the same percentage of thought as the general population of the United States. And so we have seen, it is demonstrable that percentage has already shifted in its view toward LGBTQ people, in its view toward society in general. So that we see there's surveys that show this, that those who are in favor of non-discrimination against people include 77% of white Catholics and 82% of white mainline Protestants. I mean, these are large numbers of the United States thought that have already shifted toward wanting more openness, toward being more open in their stance. Also, every time that there has been a vote at General Conference, and I would argue that the General Conference delegates are not particularly representative of the people in the pews, because the people who get elected to General Conference as delegates tend to be those who are passionately driven. Therefore, they are those who are more on the edges and not people from the center, where most of our people are. So that when those votes to become more restrictive have been taken at the various general conferences, they have not been overwhelming majorities. They have always been less than 10% in the vote shift. So that with some shifting of delegates, which has already happened, the numbers are changing, particularly within the United States. And so that the last people who were elected as delegates to General Conference have a different philosophy than those who had voted at those contentious previous General Conferences. I would also say a reason for optimism, the far right has spent more than 20 years developing an alternative denomination. From back when the UMW was rejected in favor of a different women's organization, when the Global Ministries was rejected in favor of the Mission Society. From those days through now, they've been setting up to be an alternative group to the United Methodist Church. So there's been momentum building for decades toward being separated and being different. And the WCA is ready and is poised to leave. It's a matter of, we're kind of in our, in a limbo time right now that's brought on by a global pandemic. Another reason for optimism, the history that was spoken about earlier of the splits in the church has, each of those splits, once the contentiousness is past, the churches have experienced times of growth and have done well, have flourished in those times after the split. Because who wants to go to a church that's in the middle of conflict, that does not feed one's soul, that does not draw one into a church? And so when the factors of conflict have led to a split, then the churches, the denomination in each of those instances has experienced times of growth and more prosperity as far as drawing more people in. So I would conclude by saying I am optimistic that the post-separation United Methodist Church can actually get to our motto of open hearts, open minds, and open doors. I would say, it was brought up earlier, what would Jesus do? And I would say, who would Jesus exclude? And to follow the teachings of Jesus means that we are not excluding people who are on the edges in any way. So I believe that the future is bright once we get past this painful tear that we are in the middle of. And it's kind of, instead of ripping the Band-Aid off slowly because of global situations, we are pulling that Band-Aid off as slowly as possible, and it's hurting a lot. But we will get there, and we will be stronger by getting there together. And many churches are going to be in much better shape than they think they will be by staying together with the United Methodist, with the post-separation United Methodist Church. We will still be in a place where the clergy will be placed in churches, and the churches will not be left out to fend for themselves in clergy transitions, that we will be able to focus on reaching diverse people for Christ, and that we will get to the point of having open hearts, open minds, and open doors, which is the mission that Jesus spoke of and left us with.
Thank you, Jeannie. And I just want to say a quick thanks to all of these panelists who've given up their Sunday afternoon. And we're looking at the questions. And as we do that, I'm going to put on the screen, because number one, I've listed here some of the websites that we've mentioned. And that UMC-conferencing is the website where you can find Dr. Lawrence's articles, which are very, very well done. But there's Resist Harm, there's the Stay UMC, and I also just threw up the Reconciling Ministries Network. But Kathy, your questions are popular, and are these your questions? You said, what is important while we wait? You said, what do you need from your pastor, etc. What do you like about our building? Was that the question?
Yes, but Scott, give me about 5 minutes and I will send those to you, because the building, that first part was a whole different meeting that we had. So give me about 5 minutes and let me see if I can get.
And for those who are wondering, I'll put that up at the very end then. Okay, so why don't we start with an easy question. Why in the world would we give $25 million to a denomination that we would see as being exclusionary? Who wants to take that? I see Jen. I think Jen wants to take it. David, Valerie. Who wants to take that question?
Go, Jen.
I'll start and you can pile on. The $25 million was negotiated when that protocol was being negotiated. And it was, the group of people that came to the table to negotiate the protocol and the leadership that they had in Kenneth Feynman, they said that they made compromises. Everybody made compromises. And that was the one thing that all of these different groups could get on board with and agree to. And so that's why that amount was negotiated. And again, the 25 million being set aside specifically for what it was the WCA and for what is becoming the Global Methodist Church was because of all this groundwork that they've done. As Jeannie was saying, they've been working on this for decades, and they were able to show, look, we can pull the trigger and get this done right away. Where it would be for other denominations and for like the liberal Methodist connection and those that would be on the more progressive side, it would be kind of coming up with it from scratch. Now that negotiation happened in the middle and latter part of 2019. We've had a big change in our financial situation since then. And that is one reason that the protocol is such a hot topic, and why, when there was going to be a short special called General Conference this year, that the protocol was asked to be put on the agenda, and that was rejected, and then that special General Conference was rejected. But because that amount of money is such an incentive, why would we pay it? To go ahead and split and not have to sue each other. That's why, basically.
And I think also they say, like, we already know that we have sort of this many churches out there. And then they say, this sort of represents the money that we have put into the denomination over the past, dozens of years. They also say 25 million is just a drop in the bucket in terms of what the Methodist Church actually has in assets. So those are some of the things as well. But I understand completely how it would grind our gears that we don't want to give that money to a denomination that we would not personally want to support, for example. That makes total sense. David, do you want to add any words of wisdom to that?
I'd like to add something
Jeannie,
to that.
Yeah,
I think
Jeannie.
you did well. Jeannie had her hand up.
Yes, 25 million is peanuts compared to what they would be walking away from as far as the assets that are owned by the individual annual conferences. In our annual conference, there's more money than that in just 3 of the estates that the annual conference owns, and every annual conference has assets in those similar categories.
I know this sounds interesting, weird, but I did find in my research of doing some historical research, I guess, that when the central jurisdiction was formed, I'm sorry, not serious, it wasn't that. It was when the Methodist Episcopal Church South then said, oh, these are African-American churches or Black churches, you guys can go ahead and go. And when that happened, they left at that time, which was 1870, and they'd had $1.5 million in assets. That's how many churches, properties, everything. I thought that was, there is some precedence, and that's what they took with them at that time in 1870.
God, I could add one little legal caveat, since I'm throwing a lot of flies in the ointment today of the global Methodist connections perceptions. Let's just say there's a large church in Oklahoma that wanted to leave and join a different denomination. Some of their assets would have been left in wills and bequests. Many of those often say, if the blank United Methodist Church ceased to exist, these assets roll to the annual conference. I believe their assumption is they're taking everything and they want to make sure they have an exit plan, but I'm not sure. Just like if my church left, we have lots of assets. Being a big church, we have lots of money in endowments. I'm not sure just because we would say, oh, we're going to leave, and the conference negotiated a disaffiliation, that legally the new church would get to take those funds that were contributed to the United Methodist Church. I think they believe they're taking it all. I think that is still up to dispute. But like Jeannie said, if we get into we mentioned some of these other denominations who have left. Some of them have spent millions upon millions of dollars in legal battles contesting who's leaving and who gets to keep the property and the assets. If we can avoid the U.S. courts, surely it will serve the mission more effectively in the long run. So 25 million might just be worth it. That's what I'm saying.
One way I look at it is, if you're a couple and you need to get a divorce, let's say you have children, do you drag each other through the mud? Do you be public about it? Do you sling mud, right? Do you make your ex-partner look as horrible as possible? Or do you want to sort of separate and not have that mudslinging? And that's really a question that each one of us sort of has to ask ourselves. And I think in the heat of the moment, probably people on all sides, get upset and say things, and I would even dare say sling mud. But I think at the end of the day, we really ought to ask ourselves, if we are going to separate, and I don't know what kind of language we want to use about that, because people don't like the language of divorce, for example. They don't like the language of a church split. They just want to say, well, a small portion is breaking off. That isn't really a split. Let's don't worry about any of that. If there's some kind of quote split, however you wanted to define that, do we want it to be as amicable as possible, or do we want it to really be nasty? And that's kind of a question we all have to ask ourselves. I know our panelists have seen the questions. Does anybody want to dive in with any of the questions?
Scott, I just see the one that's in the chat about electing new delegates or not. The discipline, as it does on most things, has instruction on that says delegates to the general conference shall be elected at the session of the annual conference held not more than 2 annual conference sessions before the calendar year preceding the session of the general conference. So, that's the problem with the postponements. Does it, invalidate all delegates who were elected more than 2 years ago, which is almost all of those delegates. So it's going to be an interesting ruling by bishops or the judicial council on whether or not all delegates need to, it has to be all new elections, or if people previously elected, since it was a postponed general conference, can serve. So that's the problem with whether or not, it's not like annual conferences decide how to do that. It's in the Book of Discipline about when elections have to happen.
The interesting thing about that is that on the laity side, we have had to move up delegates that were reserved delegates, because we've had some that have dropped off. And I think we're at the point that we cannot lose any more delegates on the laity side, or we will be short.
That's interesting. Yes. So let's start with this one. What is the status of the lawsuit between Southern Methodist University and one of our Texas conferences over who will control future of Southern Methodist? I believe that's actually between SMU and the whole jurisdiction. I could be wrong about that, because the jurisdiction owns SMU. I understand SMU is flexing their independence, and a Texas conference claims it's not that a Texas conference, it's the whole South Central jurisdiction, that would include us, own SMU. This relates to the proposed separation of the conference from UMC to join GMC. Anybody want to tackle that? I would just say, since no one's speaking up, that Jeremy Smith, who is a former pastor from Oklahoma, now in Seattle, Washington, has talked about this is part of the secular courts, that the secular courts have ruled in favor of SMU. I believe that the South Central jurisdiction is repeal. What do you call that? Appealing, not repealing. Appealing that decision. Essentially, this is a matter of also involving the trust clause. As many of you know, Methodists own their buildings, but we own them in trust for the annual conference. And so if the secular courts were to rule in favor of a local entity such as SMU or the a local Methodist church, that certainly throws a wrench into things. So the SMU situation is really not resolved totally yet, but it's going to be appealed. And I think that if we can agree that churches can leave, that's a totally different thing. A church today can negotiate with the annual conference trustees and with the bishop to leave the annual conference. So that existed before St. Louis General Conference. It's existed since the St. Louis General Conference. Churches can leave. It's not easy, but they can leave. And that happens between the conference leadership and between the conference trustees and then your local church leadership. So, but as far as, so if that, again, this kind of goes back to, do we want an amicable separation or do we want to be nasty about it? So let's look at this question here. What have other denominations that have addressed this issue decided, and how are their decisions working for them? Well, we've alluded to that, I think. Trina did, the Lutherans, Episcopalians, the UCC. I thought the Episcopalians decided to leave to their local parishes to decide whether or not they would conduct the same-sex marriage. If my understanding is correct, that decision cooled some of the heated rhetoric, and is it working for them? Why can't we learn from others and not reinvent the wheel? It seems that we are in a power struggle between conservative traditionalists and progressive Methodists.
You know, just one quick word about like making this an equal power struggle, because it's not. Don't forget that the way we have it right now is that the conservatives are telling the progressives not to do marriages and not to allow ordination. And so I think that for it to be an equal power struggle, you know, or to be on equal footing is to say, you be you, allow me to be me, but we do not have that in our current system. To go back to the question of denominations, if I understand this right, the Presbyterians and the Lutherans both had splits. And so the main branches moved to inclusivity, but smaller branches kind of broke off to allow for the conservatives to have a home. The Episcopalians, I think, have done actually probably the best in our country, because what they've done is, I think you're right in terms of parishes for marriages, but it's still diocese by diocese for ordination. And if I understand it right, there's only 2 holdout dioceses that are not allowing ordination, and they are outnumbered. And so like an element of peer pressure is acting on those. But don't forget, you know, United Methodist Church just operates so much differently. At the last General Conference, we had 42% of our delegates from outside of the United States. Was it 33% from Africa alone? So when we're voting on, you know, when we compare us to denominations that are just in the United States, it's really not apples to apples.
So here's a question. If we are an inclusive church, would that include allowing ministers to refuse to perform a marriage ceremony if there was a same gender couple asking to get married?
Well, right now, ministers can refuse to marry anybody they want to.
For any reason, right? Like the
Right,
couple's
for any
not ready. You don't think the couple's ready.
They didn't do counseling.
They didn't commit to the counseling.
I think if a minister is at a church that is inclusive, open and affirming, and a couple comes and says, as a same gender couple comes and says, we want to be married, and that individual pastor says, well, I don't do weddings of same gender, then I think there's a problem there. Because if you're at a church that's a reconciling congregation, or a church that considers themselves inclusive and open and affirming of LGBTQ persons, then there's something that's not right there. I don't know if they could get in trouble if we had become that type of I don't know if that's what the question really is does a person, if things go to that at the post-separation United Methodist Church, maybe if this annual conference becomes inclusive, what does that mean for the individual churches? And I think that might be some of the fear that people have. But at this point, pastors can say, no, I'm not marrying you for any reason. And that couple will just go down the road unless they want to put up a fight.
So I hope that answered that question. Just a note to the panelists, no one else can see our chat section. So I've been putting the questions in the chat section, but if you're answering them, no one else can see them but us. So as you guys go back to those questions, Jen's laughing. Here's a question that came up that you've not seen yet, and so I'll answer it unless you want to jump in. Instead of an amicable or a hostile breakup, I assume, can we determine what would be financially fair, taking account of pensions, property, and endowments? If the UMC dissolved, could individual churches keep the assets? I'll just say, I don't think the UMC wants to dissolve. I think that the vast majority of people in the current UMC does not want to see the UMC dissolve. And I think that what the protocol tries to do is to say, if there are splits, if there are branches, if the WCA is a branch, if the Liberation Methodists are a branch, if you stay in the Methodist family, that we're going to make it as easy as possible in terms of we're all going to get to use the same pension company, Westpath, right? So if you're in a WCA, you don't have to go pick a new pension company or form your own company, right? I don't even know if company is the right word, but you know what I mean. So that would be sort of making it a little bit easier that the clergy who join those denominations, their pension just stays with the same Westpath. And at property, David raised the issue of endowments, and I can guarantee you, I know this personally from my own church, the conference is going to look at all of our financial data, and we're going to look at it as well. If we do have endowments, we're going to have to show legally that there's no restrictions on those endowments. So so I don't know how that applies with the protocol passes. See, if you're a lawyer, you eat this stuff up, right? This is you're passionate about these kinds of questions, and most of us don't think in these details, right? But if a church has an endowment, there may be restrictions that they wouldn't be able to take that endowment with them, even to the WCA Global Methodist Church or the Liberation Methodist Church. But if there's no restrictions, then the protocol and the conference, I say this only if we look at the legislation passed, right? We really can't guess on any of this. As somebody's already alluded to, I think it was David, it may have been Jen, it could have been Jeannie. Until this stuff is passed and we have the actual rules in front of us, all we're doing is making our best guesses. Some of them are really good educating guesses and some of them aren't. Jen, are you raising your hand?
Yes. Well, I was going to add, I mean, our annual conference has pretty well said, listen, we don't have the resources to dig in and try to answer all of these questions when there's so much unknown. So y'all are going to have to hold on your horses and wait about getting actual numbers for your actual churches until we have some legislation that has actually passed, and then we can get out our calculators.
Actually, I think the new Office of Transition is, though, designed to begin to address that after that office is created as of July 1. I know there are churches who've already asked for their pension liability, if that's going to be one of the stipulations to pay before you disaffiliate, no matter where you're going. So I know there's work being done on that.
And David, what I've heard is that to disaffiliate, there are some costs upon the local church. The way to get the Office of Transition to give us those numbers is to have a request from a local church, not just a clergy. And so the leadership council needs to be the one to ask for that.
I believe that's.
I think we also need to point out that people are bringing up questions and really concerned about the property that their own local church owns. But the endowments that the annual conference collectively owns are significantly more, and that is a much bigger question.
So let me just go back. I want to make sure we don't leave anybody out. Some of these questions may not be answerable, but let's see. Somebody made the comment, new occasions teach new duties, time makes ancient good uncouth. They must also move onward, upward. Who could keep abreast of truth? Would the panelists care to comment on this? I think David did, and David said, I do think we will see new or realigned structures going forth, even as the United Methodist Church continues. But I think it will be a few years down the line. Since we are a large bureaucracy, change comes very slowly. David, that's not what we want to hear. Somebody else posted that Richard Rohr said, everything is passing away, quote, and he linked it to scriptures that say the same. What do you think? Do you agree? Everything is passing away. Well, that's a sermon right there. We have about 20 minutes.
Well, sorry, I already preached today.
I think I'll just say that. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it kind of goes back to that quote by Martin Luther King Jr., that the church seems to always be like 2 decades or more behind. We're like a half a generation or more behind what's happening in our world. And, you know, we want to dig our heels in always and say, no, this is who we should, we're being Christ-like, you know, and this is who we should be. And even in the moments that we have misinterpreted scripture and we have used scripture to the detriment and harm towards others, we've still dug our heels, and there's still those that evidence that still remains, that that's still who we are as a church, not just United Methodist. I'm talking about like church, just who we are as people. And so that's been, we're always behind.
Well, and let me say also, the last church I served was a former Evangelical United Brethren church. And there were people every single year that in various ways would remind me of that. And because they knew what it was like prior to 1968. I loved hearing the history of that church. In the choir room, or up in the history room maybe, there was 20 or 30 EUB hymnals. They hadn't used those hymnals in 50 years, right? So there are people that very well understand change. And I don't want to dismiss anyone's passions or concerns, but all of our buildings, talk about our things passing away. As all of us on this panel know, it takes a lot of money to keep our buildings. David Wiggs knows it better than any of us probably. And sometimes you might think, man, this money could be used for something else, but you want your building to be there, right? But at the end of the day, which is more important, our building or people? And I know buildings are important. We want our buildings to be here forever, but some of them aren't going to be here forever. And I've served a church where is a merger, and we walked away from a building that has historical ties to OCU and has historical markers still on it, even though there's a new church meeting there that's an independent church. And one of the churches that merged this last summer, the building got torn down. And we had sold it, but then when it got torn down, that was like it was like the Band-Aid was off, but then it was like somebody just, made the wound come back, right? And so I just want to say, like, yeah, everything changes. And yeah, everything passes away. I mean, we know that. We just don't want it to pass away tomorrow, right? Most of us think in terms of being Methodist, but our EUB siblings know that they gave up a whole lot. The United part is for them, but let's be honest, that doesn't really identify them as the word Methodist identifies us, right? So they gave up a whole lot. And if anyone who served in one of those churches will tell you, they haven't forgotten who they were prior to 1968. They just haven't. And so I don't want to dismiss anyone's pain, but I also, go ahead. Yeah.
And I mean, just to say, we don't know how this is all going to pan out.
No.
The General Conference, I don't know when it will meet, and I don't know what they're going to decide, but it could be that me as a progressive will be the one packing my bags. And it will be painful. I am a child, a baby who was born in the United Methodist Church. There's hardly a Sunday that I have not been in a church in my entire life. It will pain me if that's the case. But I do firmly believe that the time has come for me to stop standing with a denomination that is exclusive. So knowing that, I'm just saying the change will be hard if I'm the one who has to leave.
One of the comments was that rural churches are where direction of the Methodism is disappearing. A lot of us have served in rural places. And just because we're in the city doesn't mean we're in a big church with lots of money either. Our situations may be very similar, even though the settings are very different. That's a whole nother panel, really, which I would like to pull together, is to get some of our rural pastors and our mid-sized town pastors together, who perhaps are serving churches that are more divided than those of us on this panel, and have that kind of discussion. And the reality is that rural Methodism may be disappearing, but Methodism in the cities is also disappearing. There's churches in the cities that are also closing, right? There's one near us that's probably on the verge of closing, and it has been for a few years. So that's the issue, isn't it? That Methodism has been declining, at least in the United States, for more than 50 years. And that's part of our issue and the part of what we're mourning, in all honesty. Here's the question also: how will the which we kind of have alluded to, but I don't want to leave anybody out on the questions. How will the boards and commissions deal with the split? For example, the United Methodist Men are already working on a plan to serve more than just one single denomination. Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, Westpath, that handles the pensions for clergy and some laity, began to see this years ago, and because they deal with money, they want to make sure they had all their legalities worked out way ahead of anything happening. And they've worked that out to structure themselves to do that. But it's, I think it's a little optimistic, more optimistic than I am. I'll say that one organization like United Methodist Men or United Methodist Women can serve denominations, one of which is saying everyone in that other group, let me just tell you, they don't really believe in Jesus or the Bible. If I'm just sending you checks for your pensions, you don't have to weigh in on theology. But if you're a programming unit, that's a very different experience. And since that kind of rhetoric's already begun long ago by some, I think that it's unlikely that our programming groups will serve both an emerging denomination or a leaving group and the current one. And as Jeannie or one of you already pointed out, on the conservative side, they started their own publications, their own publishing house, their own women's unit, their own mission sending agency. They have already established in certain formats a structure because they didn't like the one that was currently serving the denomination because they wanted it to be more narrow and more exclusive, is what my view is. They would say, more effective or more faithful, just to be fair. But I think it's unlikely that we'll see something like United Methodist Men actually being able to serve across those denominations in the long run. There was also the question back in there, Scott, about rural and urban church splits. Is that, part of what's going on? Certainly we know demographically populations are moving to the urban area, but as you said, a church can shrink and die away in any setting. I think, the important thing about Kathy's question, especially for a smaller rural church, I think I've served some and I was district superintendent for several, is for them to have discussions about who do we want to be as a church. I would say don't wait for the denomination to tell you as a local church, even if there's 20 of you, you decide, do we want to be exclusive and say we don't want you if you identify in a certain way, or do we want to be inclusive? Do we want to work with everyone seeking Christ or do we not? I think that would help them determine which group to go with if there is that decision to be made at a local church level. Again, that's speculation that local churches will have any decision-making, to decide about. But I think that, Kathy's questions really helped a local church focus in on who do we want to be to each other? How do we want to treat each other? Which I think is important. For me as a progressive leaning person, I would love for all United Methodist churches who believe inclusion to begin acting like that right now. But I understand there can be repercussions to that, but there's a lot we can do to be inclusive without violating our current discipline. So I would encourage local churches to take some authority and take some time to have discussions that they maybe haven't had before. It doesn't have to be, I don't think it has to be so divisive that you split the church right off. My experience is a few people who are strident may leave, but for the most part, United Methodists like to be united, want to be together, chose that church for a reason, and those personal relationships and bonds are really strong, and I think can get us through a lot of this.
But I still say that if we have a hard time, we found this out over last summer, a lot last year. Of course, we were under the heaviness of the pandemic. But the whole BLM, a pastor saying in all kinds of churches throughout Oklahoma, I'm speaking in the United Methodist Church, saying BLM, Black Lives Matter, saying, anything to that or speaking out against police brutality or anything like that, when some of the things I know I've heard from some of the various pastors, that they were badgered and ridiculed, or however you want to say it, but and some were even told, you know, you don't get up in the pulpit and speak that's political, because so even speaking about, I have a feeling, because narratives get changed and hijacked, that even with that, so if we start talking about LGBTQ from the pulpit in an area that maybe is not leaning progressive or even centrist, it may be detrimental, but that's been.
Yeah, I wasn't saying from the pulpit. I said, I didn't, maybe when I said start a discussion, Jen can verify. I don't mean in the pulpit. That's a one-way communication. I think that is usually a disaster. I mean, have a conversation like, let's get together in the fellowship hall and talk about these questions. I don't mean the pastor declaring any position, because that, I don't think that's really fair actually most of the time, because it's such a one-way communication. If you haven't written about it or had discussion with your leadership or given the membership a chance to discuss it, I think those forums are much better places, whether it's Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ inclusion, that, you know, people do have feelings, and you got to give a space to process some of that, is what I would suggest. That would give me hope, is that if we'd start having the conversations.
That's good. That's good.
Another thing, I would just say, you know, any movement that's been politicized and is high in the media, getting attention, to say those same words without putting it in a clear theological or biblical context is a mistake I've seen pastors make over and over. If you don't do your biblical and theological foundation before you use words that the media uses, what you've done is said, I mean what they mean. And often I think we mean something different than that, even though we might be using the same word. So I think we've got, as pastors and leaders, we should think really carefully and strategically about how do we speak and how do we engage our people in dialogue. You know, I don't say everything I believe right off before I've built some rapport and foundations, you know, because I know it can't be heard. It will not be heard the way I intend it. So if I want to communicate well, I've got to do some other steps before I'm saying it in the pulpit. But that's just obviously my view of pastoral ministry.
Okay, friends, here's the last question, and each of us could just give a short answer. What gives you hope?
I'll jump in. You know, what I find is even people who have trouble with something like Black Lives Matter or inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community, what they really want is a pathway, how I can be a Christian and affirm that. And what they've been given are the obstacles. You know, in televangelism is way bigger than progressive television ministry. And so conservative religion tends to get to frame the issues for Americans. And so we've got to just be aware of all that. I find if I can give them a pathway to be Christian and be more inclusive and loving, most Methodists will join you on that pathway. Not everybody, but I find majorities of people will join us if we give them a clear pathway to do that. That gives me hope.
Next.
We sing a song at the end of church sometime called Goodness is Stronger Than Evil. It is one of the songs that we love to sing as our departing chorus. And that gives me hope. I truly believe that we are on the not just the right side of history, but from every understanding I have of who Jesus has taught us to be, we are walking the walk. And that gives me hope. And there's going to be pitfalls along the way, but I think that we draw strength from each other. And so I think that's part of the reason things like this are good, so that we get a chance to see one another, and other people get to be a part of that as well.
I think there's hope in what's broken, that what will come of it will be a better home for me. And so I hate watching my denomination break right now. It's heartbreaking for me, honestly. But at the end of the day, my hope is that I will be in a church that is inclusive and affirming of all people. And I have hoped for that for so long that that does make me happy.
Okay, so I'm a Trekkie, and and I just know that whenever I think about the fact that, from the James T. Kirk, Captain James T. Kirk days, the original Star Trek, how there was a problem with the Romulans, there was a problem with the Klingons, there was a problem with all these different ones, and then you see them, on like Deep Space Nine, and I love Gene Roddenberry, clearly, the late Gene Roddenberry, and you see them all together, even on The Next Generation with Captain Picard, where all of a sudden you have a Klingon that's like, he's like one of the officers. You have Romulans, you have, all these different people that are there, or beings that are part of it now that before they fought with, and there was a problem with. And so my hope is very much like Gene Roddenberry's hope, that eventually we will come together. I hope it doesn't take us 95 years this time, but my prayer is that I want to see in my lifetime that we come together. And I know God is always up to something. I just believe it.
I would say that I have hope by looking at those pastors and those churches that are leading the way toward the centrist, progressive stance and in the inclusion of the church, that they are some of our best and brightest and most articulate leaders, and that they are good people to be paired with or to be in coalition with. And I am pleased, honored, happy that that is the future, to be allied with such people as those.
I would say that what gives me hope is that I see, I did do ministry in a rural church that became a reconciling church. Calera United Methodist Church, shout out to you. They call themselves a rainbow church, and they truly are a rainbow church. And what I have hope for is that even those churches that don't want to become a reconciling church, even those that are not ready to, hang the rainbow flag outside, if you're a United Methodist congregation in a rural area, you may well be the most progressive church in the town, even if you consider yourself somewhat conservative. And I have hope that that is a place that youth who are coming out, who don't know where else to go, will have the ability to at least connect with a pastor who will have compassion. And even if they are questioning, church and a pastor that are questioning, how can we affirm this, we don't really know yet, but that are willing to engage in the conversation. I believe that everybody is on a path, that none of us are beyond transformation, that God is still working with all of us and through all of us. And every person that I am in communion with that is United Methodist, I believe is truly doing the very best they can to follow what they believe is the will of God. Totally disagree with some of them, but I do believe that the heart is right, and that God is working with us and through us to offer compassion and love and inclusion to the people in our communities. And so that's where my hope is. And also, I choose to stay in Oklahoma as a United Methodist clergy that is outwardly progressive and inclusive in Oklahoma. And so I don't like a monoculture. That's not what I'm looking for. Otherwise, I could go find somewhere else to fit in really easily. But I choose and I feel called to stay in ministry here. And I'm grateful for the companions on the journey.
So real quick, I just want to say, do what?
Don't forget to let Kathy answer.
I think she did. She talked about her
Oh, okay.
song.
It's after David. Sorry.
Did everybody answer? Okay. I just want to thank our panelists. They gave up 2 hours of their time. It's exactly 6 o'clock. And I know the people watching this are only watching it on YouTube. So I have put Kathy's questions to her church in the comment section. And I also put the websites we mentioned. And one question was sent to me and it said, what was the articles about the legal arguments of the protocol that David referenced? That's the UMC-conferencing.org. On the homepage, there's 5 articles by William Lawrence. So go to that website, get those articles, read them. They're very powerful. I'll just say what gives me hope is God and God's just incredible ability to work miracles. And yes, I am a progressive who believes in miracles. And I just want to close with this one story that I asked somebody just recently, what do we do to change people's hearts and minds? I'm really more interested in that than all the politics of how do we get votes and how do we get, rules changed, although that's extremely important. My question is, well, how do we change hearts and minds? I don't want to just see people walk away and then continue to have beliefs that say, well, you can't really be gay and go to heaven, for example. I really want to change their minds about that. And there's just a story that brings me hope. And it's a silly story, but preachers love silly stories. There's a story about, St. Peter and others at the gate. And they were rejecting people saying, no, you didn't make it into heaven. We're sorry. And so they keep good numbers. And so they knew who should be in heaven and who wasn't getting in heaven. But the numbers kept growing, and Peter knew, like, these numbers aren't matching my numbers. I'm turning too many people away. What's going on here? And finally, an angel came to Peter and said, I found out what's going on. About a mile down the wall, Jesus is a ladder, and he's letting everybody that you're rejecting get over the wall and get into heaven. And that's my hope, is that Jesus has the last word. And do I think I'm right about everything? Absolutely not. And there are things I don't understand in this world. And people may say, I don't understand how someone could be gay. I don't understand how somebody could be a transgender. I don't understand what non-binary means. We don't have to understand all that, but we can show compassion, and we can also seek to educate ourselves, and we can be open to change, and we do not have to condemn people. And so that's really my hope, is that we will want to listen and talk with each other and have our hearts and our minds changed. Thank you all. It's been 2 hours, and so we're going to close out. So I'm going to shut off the YouTube. And for those who are watching on YouTube, we've had a good group hanging in here with us. At least 70 have made it. There was 80 at one point. Thank